Okay, so today we're going to start talking about panoramic photography. And the interesting thing is that when you get into the combination of panoramas and HDRR images, which we talked about last class, is when we start to get into some really good stuff for rendering and that sort of thing. In an early class like this, we need to talk about the basics of it so that we can talk about panoramas. In its most basic form, well, you guys, this is always frustrating when I date myself, right? In between the world of film cameras and digital cameras, there was this thing that came out that was called the Advantix camera. It was a really big deal, and you could take panoramas, or you would buy like a little panorama camera. A few of you maybe remember that. Most of you are staring at me like I'm cuckoo. But anyway, it was a big deal, and all that really did was try to give you a little bit wider angle view than what was normal. The kinds of panoramas that we're talking about today are more of a 360 panorama. It's a full view of what you're standing in. So here's an example of a drawn panorama. The idea behind these is that if you take one edge and the other edge and you fold it around behind you, it becomes the full 360 of that particular point. And these are not something that are easy to capture in one shot. There are a couple specialty pieces of equipment that basically involve a camera and a special parabolic lens where you shoot into the parabolic lens and then it captures the 360 all at once. The truth is you lose so much resolution because you're distorting through the mirror that it's really not as good as actually taking a bunch of individual pictures and stitching them together. And that's where it starts to become more powerful. Now, it is very dependent on what your camera is and what your lens is as to how many images it's going to take to make something like this. But in an ideal world, we're going to try to capture the 360. So this is a little drawing I did that kind of tries to illustrate this. This is with my old camera. But the idea is that you take a bunch of pictures and that those pictures overlap each other and form the 360-degree ball that's around you. The good news is there are some phone apps that help you do this that make life really, really easy. We'll talk about those in a second. But we need a way of capturing that 360-degree view. So I did... I kind of got really excited about this in kind of about, 2004, 2005, something like that. So I spent some time building a panoramic rig for my camera. Actually, it was for the camera before this one. This is a new evolution of that rig. To be able to capture these 360-degree images relatively easily. And I got really excited about it, and I used to do it a lot, and then I had kids, and I no longer have time to do it. But on an ideal day, I would do it again. This kind of a rig, if you were to go buy one for a camera, is in the neighborhood of about $900, $1,000. I didn't want to spend that money, so I drew up my own, and a friend and I kind of got together. We had it professionally laser cut, and it's out of aluminum. So it worked out pretty well, and this has traveled a lot of places with me. I still don't know why airplanes let me check this or bring it onto the airplane, because it's kind of scary looking, but they do, and so it's always worked out. I've never had an issue with that. So this is my rig for my camera, for my lens. And one of the critical things to understand about how this sort of works is there's a point in the lens where the image, just like in your eye, where the image actually flips upside down. It's called the nodal point of the lens, right? So the light comes into the image, as it passes through the image, it flips before it hits the sensor. That particular point is the ideal point to center a panorama around. And so, all too often, if we're shooting a panorama, whether it's with our phones or our cameras, we might go click, 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 and come around like that. In an ideal world, you want to isolate the camera and move around the camera point. And so that's exactly what this particular apparatus does, is it does its very best to isolate that point, which is right in the center of the lens right here, and it rotates around that point no matter where I move the camera. Right? So I can actually hold my finger in roughly the same place, and the camera just moves around. Furthermore, it isolates it in an up and down movement, so I can drop the camera or I can raise the camera up, and at that point still stays in the same place. And that's what's allowing me to get the full 360 without kind of weird artifacting lines and that sort of thing, which can happen. The other thing that I did to make my life easy is on this tripod, which is a very stable, heavy tripod, I also have what's called a click-stop head, which basically lets me set a number of degrees, and it will actually click and stop at each of those intervals, which make taking the panorama really, really easy. In the old days, when I had an old, it was actually this rig, and my old tripod, I just had marks that were labeled on the tripod, and I'd have to be down here while I was shooting and jumping. Oh, there's my mark. Okay, let me take a picture. faster, and then it took a lot longer. This is really easy. It doesn't take very long. Probably about 30 seconds to get around. Because it stops automatically, you just take your next shot, and you do it around. If I had a different lens, this is an 18mm wide angle. If I had a different lens, maybe like a 10mm or something, I could do it in fewer shots, which would be ideal. But I didn't spend the money on the different lens, so I shoot with this one. It takes me about 48 images to get a pretty good panorama. It can take more than that. It can take less than that. Again, it depends on your particular lens as you shoot. A couple things that are important, though. You want to make sure that you keep the same exposure throughout, so you don't want an auto exposure setting where you're exposing for outside in the drizzle right now, even though it wasn't supposed to rain today, or you're exposing for inside. You want it to be consistent, so if you're exposing for outside, everything's shot that way, because when you stitch it together, you get weird images that are lighter or darker, and I'll show you some examples of that as we go forward. So anyway, this is kind of conceptual how you would go about shooting a panoramic image, right? And then we'll go ahead and show you a bunch of examples so that you can see what they do. All right. Okay, so in terms of final results, we can get two different things. One is an unrolled image, which I'll show you a bunch of in lecture slides. The other is what's called an interactive movie. It was a QuickTime virtual reality movie originally. Now it's being done mostly with HTML5 in terms of how you actually do it. But it's designed, you've probably been to websites that do this. Right, you go somewhere, you're looking at a hotel room, they have a 360-degree view, and you can kind of look around and have that immersive experience. That's what these allow us to have. So how do we go about processing these images? How do we stitch them together? What do we have? What options do we have? First option is Photoshop, which is available on all the lab computers. If you have a small group of overlapping images, Photoshop is fantastic at stitching them together. Right? If you have a full 360 with 67 images or whatever, Photoshop's not going to do a very good job. It'll get some of it, but it's much better in a smaller group. Right? So you want to be thinking small group for Photoshop. It is an automated process, just like we did the merge to HDR Pro last time. It's the same kind of an automated process. You say, I want to photo merge these photos. It builds you a merge of those. And so we'll walk through that, and I'll show you how to do that. Okay? Stitcher, which was originally an independent software, it's since been bought by Autodesk and kind of stopped development. Autodesk bought it, and I don't really know why they bought it, and that kind of killed it. It was a great application. It was very graphic. You'd drag an image in, you kind of align it where you wanted to go, you'd hit enter, and it would stitch it kind of magically. It was pretty cool. But it is still out there. I think the newest version is like 2009 or something, so it's not particularly updated, but it does exist, and it's pretty good at stitching images together. I did a lot of stitching in Stitcher for a while. PTGUI is a graphic interface on top of a set of tools called PanoTools. That was an open source way of stitching panoramas together. There are a lot of stitching applications that are built on top of this kind of base code. PTGUI is the one that I used for a lot of my stitching operations. It's very fine control, and I'll show you some examples in a different program, but it's kind of the same thing, where you can pick this point in this image is the same as this point in this image, and then it will custom warp the image so that they stitch together. It's pretty neat technology. Huggin is the free version of PTGUI. Huggin's installed on the computers in the lab at my request. You will be able to play around with it today and see how it works for you. It's kind of hit or miss. It works really well for some people. It doesn't work well for other people. There is a quirk that we will talk about. That's a great slide. There is a quirk that we will talk about in it that if you don't disable the fast preview mode, it'll crash all the computers in the labs. You have to kind of go through that. But it's free. If you're interested in panoramas, you can download it yourself on your own computer and play around with it. So it makes it a pretty good solution. This is something that was brought to my attention actually last semester. It's called Photosphere. It's by Google, and it works on both iOS and Android devices. It's really, really cool. It basically will let you stitch this stuff together on the fly with your phone, which is a whole lot easier than doing it with a camera and a bunch of sophisticated software. It works really, really well if you're outside in a wide open place. If you try to do it inside, it's not going to work. They have some examples of interior shots. And I wouldn't be surprised if they did them in something else and just said they were done in this, because it's really, really hard to do it. But I would encourage you, if you have an Android phone or an iOS phone, go ahead and download it and play around with it, because it's pretty fun. And it's definitely worth experimenting with. I did used to bring up a few of the other Panorama applications that are available on the phone. I think people are somewhat familiar with those, so I won't dwell on those for very long. Right. Part of the reason that I like this one is it is a full 360. It'll let you capture up above and down below, as opposed to just a straight panorama. So let's look at some examples, and I can talk through some stuff that happens. This is in Tambo, Colorado, Peru. Again, a full 360. So we start to see things on this side. We'll line up with things on this side. So if we were curling that together, it would make 360. Furthermore, the ground here comes together at the top, so it curls in both directions. Few things to be aware of. Things that are straight in reality in a panorama appear curved. Things that are curved in reality appear straight in a panorama. So you have to get used to kind of that thing, and I'll show you an example of that in a second. The other thing that happens if you have a mistake in your exposure, you can, and that's part of why I left this version of this shot there. This is obviously Photoshoppable, and we can get rid of it. But this was an exposure that was wrong when I shot the images, and when you go to stitch it together, you end up with that kind of dark bar that doesn't match the rest of the sky, which is why exposure locking is so important. Right? Another example, this has been cropped down to eliminate some of the mistakes that are up in the sky, and so it gives you an idea of kind of how these forms come together. This is up in Maray in Peru, Sacsayhuaman. This was a fun place to go. Anyway, it's kind of this open canyon. Got a bunch of these little pieces shot from far away. Gives you a little bit of sense. The other thing that can happen when you shoot these, this is a full 360, does curl all the way down to the top and all the way to the bottom. When you're shooting it, if you're not careful, you can miss something. Right? So I missed a hole, and you end up with a hole. Again, Photoshoppable, but not something you want to necessarily think about. Okay, so remember what I said, right? Curved things in reality appear straight, right? Straight things appear curved. So in this instance, I know they're a little curved, right? But these walls appear straight, right? That means that in reality they're curved. So that was shot directly in the center of this, right? So I shot it here, and I use this as a good example of kind of explaining how the panorama works, right? So if I were to curl this around me, we'd get what the actual physical thing looks like. And so straight lines, right, mean that it's curved in reality. This was kind of a fun shot. This was our self-portrait when we were up in the Peruvian highlands. All of us stood at these certain intervals in the picture. So it's a much bigger image, and you can actually see all of us in it. Right. All right, this is one that I actually will give you today as a sample image to play around with. It's inside Ollantaytambo. It's actually opposite. Ollantaytambo is right through that little door there. But this is inside an old abandoned building. It's kind of a good combination of images because we've got a lot of interior stuff going on, and then we've got some stuff from far away, and to see how those pieces stitch together is useful. Another example here, you can get screwed up on the horizon, right, if you're not careful, and when you do that, you can end up with these kind of snaking images, but it's correctable. Right? This was one that actually spawned a bunch of my thesis work at Berkeley. This was inside the Amtrak train station in West Oakland that's been abandoned for a long time. I think it's scheduled to be torn down. It's really sad. It's a cool building. But this is an important thing to note because we're shooting this over a period of time, right? Lots of images stitching together, just like the high dynamic range images. You get ghosting of people throughout the scene, right? So sometimes the people are there, sometimes they're not. This was a particularly good example of a lot of people moving through the space, and so you can actually capture some of that movement in one of these images. This is Werster Hall at UC Berkeley. Again, the building's not curved. It's a very straight building, but it appears curved in this. You can see a few of the errors that I made in the stitching process, right? Sky is easy to fix. Right here, there's a line that goes across the building. That's not really Photoshoppable, so you want to make sure that those mistakes don't happen as you shoot. Same image, but at night. For contrast, this one actually stitched really well together. I seamed it correctly. And then we can start to move through. Here's another example. This was another one of those self-portraits when we were playing around with photography. This is dating us. This is back when I had more hair than I do now. But this was inside a computer lab, and what we did is my friend and I took pictures of ourselves in every one of the pictures that we shot. So as you stitch, 12 images together, 13 images together, we were in every one of the images. So we appear in every, I'm there, I'm there, I'm there, I'm there, I'm looking there, and I'm looking here at myself, looking back at myself. Right? So you can play around with this, and it's important to kind of recognize that. The other thing that can happen when you shoot these images, one time there's a person standing here, the next time it's not, you get half a person. Right? We have just legs there. And so you have to be aware when you're shooting those kinds of things that they can happen. Right? Oops. Right? This one was shot on the Brooklyn Bridge in New York. I shot this one by hand, so I didn't have my tripod and stuff. As long as you keep the camera stationary and you move around the camera, you can get very, very good results. So you just want to pay attention to that when you're shooting, and you can end up with pretty darn good stitching results. Right, another example here. All right, we can flip through. You can tell I like to go hiking, so there's lots of these from hiking. This is one that I'll show you the interactive form in just a second. Right? You can also get playful with them and create more artistic renditions. These are a bunch that I shot for my thesis that were at SFO. Right? So here's a few diagrams from my thesis. Again, I told you it started with that image. And so it had to do with the interconnectivity of spaces. I ended up having to work through how to draw panoramic perspectives. So the traditional perspective is a 2-point, right? This was a spherical perspective. So you used to, instead of passing, anybody, do you guys learn how to construct perspectives ever? No, a few of you, right? A couple, right? They're complicated. This had to do with pulling lines across the sphere to get that curvature. And so I had to figure out how to draw them because I had to draw and create these kinds of perspectives for my thesis drawing. Couldn't be done by hand, I don't think. It was too complicated, so these were all done computer, but it was still hand-drawn. Right? They weren't rendered out, though today I probably would render them all out, which would make life a lot easier. Anyway, so that's a bunch of the examples. I'm going to switch over, and I'm going to show you some of the interactive stuff, and then we'll talk about how to stitch them. Okay, so I went to pull up a bunch of the example, and I got a bunch of black squares, so obviously it's missing the image. It's not loading correctly. There is one that is under Resources, Panoramas, and if you go to, which one is it? It's Angora Peak. That one will load up correctly. It's right here. And what this does is it gives you a sense of what the interactive ones are if you haven't experienced them before. Basically, if you click and drag, you can control what you're looking at. I didn't capture straight down, so I end up with a black hole straight down. Likewise, I didn't capture straight up, so I end up with a little bit of a black hole at the top. I could fix that with Photoshop, but it's enough for right now. The other thing I could do is I could restrict and not let me scroll past that and not let me scroll past there in the actual camera. But I wanted you guys to see that with the black. But it's interactive, it lets you move around, and that's kind of the purpose of it. So let's start walking through how we would go about stitching. And I have on the course website, if you go to exercise 108 at the bottom, I have some sample sets of images. And I actually took away this one because it had a mistake in it. It wasn't loading correctly for people. So I've got one from Peru and I've got one from the ET building. I've gone ahead and I've downloaded both of those. And those are the ones that I'm going to work with today, showing you the two different ways of stitching together. First one that I'm going to work on is Photoshop. So I'm going to go to Start, and I'm going to make sure that I open CS6. Remember, if you double click on something, it will open CS3, not CS6. So we just want to make sure we're in CS6. And we'll load this up. All right, so I'm going to go to the File menu, and under Automate, right, we did merge to HDR Pro last time. The next one down is called Photomerge. Okay, And this is the Photomerge dialog box. Generally speaking, I leave it set to auto, and it's the easiest way of doing it. Notice that this looks awfully similar to the Merge to HDR Pro. Basically, we're going to browse for our images. So I'll go ahead and click Browse. And let me see here. Let's go. ET building. All right, and we'll pick a few of these. I'm just picking a few lowers and uppers. I'll go ahead and say okay. We'll see how Photoshop does with them. Right? We're checking the box for blend images together, which is what we want. Vignette removal basically means if you have darkened edges to the photos, it'll try to get rid of that. Okay, good. We didn't lose it. So generally, I leave it unchecked because the images don't tend to have that. And I'll go ahead and say okay. And we'll let Photoshop do some processing. And what it's doing is it's looking for similar pieces of these images, and it's going to try to overlap them. Okay? And so it just finished, and it did a pretty decent job. Right? I'm fairly happy with how it came together. Generally, Photoshop does great for this kind of a series of images. So, if you are out doing a site analysis, right? You were out in your 220 class visiting a site. If you took a group of pictures, right, a bunch of them, and you threw them into Photoshop, you could create something like this that works pretty darn easily to give us a capture of what this scene looks like. Okay? Now, one of the things that's important to recognize here is that we have over here in our layers, right, a bunch of pieces of the image, and then we have a bunch of masks that are associated with the image. So let's take a look at some of these on an individual basis. Right? I'm going to turn them off. And then we'll start with this first image. So there's the first image, and we can see that obviously it's distorted and warped the image a bit. Right? We get the warp on the top, but notice that there's a fine little seam that it's cut right here that it's going to use to kind of join the images with its neighbors. Right? So we'll pick the next one, and we'll look at the next one, and we can see that the next one, right, depending on what we turn on and turn off, has a little seam that matches up with the first one. And that's what Photoshop was able to create for us. Okay, in terms of how these come together. If I were to turn on the bottom here, it would fill in that part of the image. Right, so there's that part of the image. We're left with the square and the round here, but then it's cut in and cut around the various parts of the image to help it stitch together nicely. And Photoshop does a very, very good job at doing this. So if we turn them all back on, something like that, recognize that we can then apply all of the same adjustments that we've done previously. So I could go up to my layer, I could say new adjustment layer, and we could do a levels adjustment. Say okay. It's not bad the way it is. Maybe I want to brighten it up slightly. Right? Let me go ahead and go to layer, new adjustment layer. Let's do a channel mixer. If I can find it. Okay. Maybe I want to switch it to monochrome, and then I want to play around with what my presets are to get whatever the look is that I'm going for. The point is, all of those same things still apply, right, to this nested group of layers rather than just an individual image. Right? And I do want you to pay a lot of attention to how these masks work and that you're aware of it. You're not going to be messing around with the masks today, but next class, you are going to work with masks pretty extensively. So it's important to kind of recognize that that's where we're going, and this is just an automated way of creating those. Okay? If in Photoshop I threw all the images, let me go to File New here. I'm going to automate, Photomerge, browse. Hit OK. For the fun of it, we'll try throwing all the images and see how it does. Maybe I can crash Photoshop. You never know. So this obviously down here was a mistake, right? I shot a little bit too low, and I got my tripod in it. Kind of annoying. All right, so there we go. It actually didn't do too bad. Okay, so we were able to get almost the full perspective stitched fairly nicely. The only challenge is that it hasn't stitched this edge seam to that edge. Right, so if we were trying to do that, we could manually go through and do that using an offset filter, but it's probably not quite there yet. You can see a little bit of this tree here would overlap with that tree there. Right, so we need to create that actual offset and make it work. So it's not quite there, but it actually did a lot better job than I thought it was going to. Okay, so we threw those examples at it. What I want you to do is do one in Photoshop like this. You don't have to do all of the images that I give you. You just need to do a group of them in Photoshop. And then we're also going to play around with Huggin. And so Huggin is a little application. There's an icon for it down here. Looks like a little person in front of a picture. Right, and so let me just see really quickly if my preview showed up. I was letting it run in the background. A second ago. Yeah, I believe it came through just fine. So before I get too far, let me go ahead and save this because I'll reopen it in just a second.
I don't see it.
Okay, good. So what I'm going to do in Huggin, let's see if I can get a new Huggin. Might not let me without quitting, so we'll go ahead and quit.
Yeah, we don't have it.
You don't have what?
Huggin.
Really? Why is it on mine? Okay, well, maybe we won't play with Huggin today.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so there. Apparently, we're not going to do that today. I apologize for that. Things are different. So concentrate on your Photoshop one. I will show you how this process works, just so you're aware if you want to play around with it. But obviously, you're not going to have to do it. And when you go to post it, because it's just Photoshop, you can, on part 2, the third step down, right, where I have those little brackets, the third bullet point down, don't do that, because you won't have the image for it. Okay? So, anyway, with Huggin, if I go to load images, I can pick a group of images. And actually, since you're not following along, I'm going to go ahead and just open the one that I did earlier today. When you click on load images, I loaded the 67 images, and then you click on align. And what it does is it goes through and tries to find similar control points between two images. So if I look at image 0 and image 1, right, side by side, this is one movement to the next. So we can see here, there's the edge of the door, there's the edge of the door, right? The software goes through and tries to find what they call control points that match up from one image to the next, right? And it will then custom warp each one of these images to come together. So I can pick any group of images, right? So for example, I could jump to image 2, right? This is image 1 and image 2. We can see there's the overlap, and there's a bunch of the control points that are defining how these two images are going to come together, right? If you don't have a good crossover of points, right, you'll be able to see as you compare these images, right? So for example, if I compared to image 6, right, obviously there's nothing between these two images that correspond correctly. But sometimes when we get up into, say, the sky, right, let's see, image 24, sorry, and we'll compare it to image 14, right? this edge here corresponds to that edge up there, right? Sometimes it has a hard time actually identifying those points. We can go through and we can actually manually add points. So you see here, I've got that little peak, right? If I were to click right on the end of that peak, right, I can then adjust my control point to be right there. And I can come up here to the same peak, and I can add the control point right there. And we can see in the image those two match, and then I can go ahead and click add. Right? So it ends up being a manual way of stitching. If you can see how these images come together but the computer doesn't, it can end up being pretty good. So once I'm done with that, we can move all the way over to the actual stitcher. And if we were doing an output to web where we're flattening up the images, I'd go into an equal rectangular projection, 360 by 180, and then I'd set this for web. So we go 2048 by 1024, right? And we're going to do exposure corrected low dynamic range, and I go ahead and click stitch. And when I do that, it's going to first ask me where do I want to save it, what do I want it to save as. So we'll save it like that, that's fine. And then it will bring up the batch processor, and it does a bunch of command line stuff, right? And this is what in a paid for application would look like a little progress bar. But since this is an open source application, it's actually letting us see what it's doing and how the computer's processing it. So I'm going to go ahead and let that run for a while. I can show you the example at the end. But it's basically, it's stitched those images together, and now it's warping the images and gluing them together. Okay? So I apologize that for whatever reason you all don't have Hug-In. I will see what's wrong with that and hopefully have it fixed so that down the road you will have it. But for today, work through Photoshop, create a piece of a panorama, stitch them together, make sure you pay attention to the maps, and then once you're done with that, you post it as exercise 108, and if you have extra time, start thinking about what you might want to do for your assignment 102. I will show you examples on Wednesday, and we'll talk through why some of them work, why some of them don't, and that'll go through kind of lighting conditions and that sort of thing. Also on Wednesday, we will deal with a bunch of masking and how that part of it works, which is exactly what you need to be able to do assignment 102. Okay? Are there any questions? Yes? If it's having trouble loading, I would just pick a smaller group of pictures. Okay?